Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, Hellstone here again, and today we are reacting to yet another video, which I am very excited about. Now, recently, I put out a poll asking you what type of videos you wanted me to react to in the future, and by far, the majority came out to be World War I videos. So this video is going to be the first, and hopefully a series, not necessarily a connected series, other than the fact that it's going to be all about the Great War. My hope is to start out with some videos, maybe about individual troops, get into big picture stuff, look at videos on the generals that fought and planned and organized the war, and it should be a really good time. I'm really excited. This video that we're going to be reacting to tonight is called Evolution of the British Infantry during World War I. Now, I am very excited about this. I do have to apologize if I seem a little tired. I have been drilling with the National Guard, and I've just gotten back, and I decided, well, I should probably put out a video for all of you guys, hence me having shaved, which I do regret that I had to, but hey, I guess that's, you do what you got to do, I guess. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into the video.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about the evolution of the British infantry in the First World War. Britain entered the war with an army that had been shaped by the Boer Wars and other colonial wars. British infantry tactics in 1914 emphasized rapid, accurate rifle volleys and finding cover by means such as entrenching. The average British private at the time, in contrast to those of the other warring armies, was a professional soldier who had served over 4 years. He was part of a platoon, which was part of a company. That company of around 150 men was the basic tactical unit, meaning that companies were given tasks and objectives, not platoons. And there was very little room for initiative or deviation at the platoon level or lower. The trained British regulars were well equipped, and many could accurately fire a mad minute, 15 rounds at 300 yards with his Lee Enfield rifle. This was just about the only weapon the British infantry used in 1914. The spaced but tightly controlled, highly trained British formations were very effective in defensive actions against exposed, close-knit attacking formations, like the German ones they faced at the Battle of the Mons, the first British encounter with Germans during the war. The Germans were taken aback by the skill of the outnumbered British, who they had seriously underestimated.
I think that's often the case we see during wars, is generals in charge of the soldiers will look solely at numbers, but I've always said this, and I do hold fast to this belief, that superior training can, in most situations, outdo superior numbers, and obviously that was true for the British from what I'm hearing at the beginning of the war.
British tactics were not, however, so effective on offense against artillery, machine gun fire, and an entrenched enemy. Indeed, it was clear early on in the war that defense was king on the Western Front, and new equipment, weapons, and tactics must be developed to break the stalemate. One change that was fairly unwelcome in the British Army was the change in the soldier himself. The British regulars had been arguably the best soldiers in the world in general, but there had only been 100,000 or so of them, and by the end of 1914, most of them were either dead, missing, prisoners of war, or too badly wounded to fight. The four types of soldiers Britain used over the course of the war were described by Professor Richard Holmes as old, new, borrowed, and blue, as in something of each that a bride should have at her wedding.
Okay, well, that's pretty interesting, and that goes back to what I had just said. I do believe that in almost all situations, superior training is better than superior numbers, but at the end of the day, you do need to supplement those professional soldiers with new soldiers, fresh soldiers, and greater number of soldiers, and oftentimes that comes at the expense of quality, and the key is finding the balance between quantity and quality, and that is actually a very tricky balance to find, especially in a type of war like the First World War, where tactics were changing, weaponry was changing, technology was changing, and obviously all the governments involved in that war had a hard time finding that new balance.
Old, as in the professionals at the beginning of the war, followed by borrowed when soldiers were borrowed from the British Territorial Army, the reserves for home defense. New was the army of volunteers that came after them, and finally, the blue of the conscripted men. The territorials were first used to replace the regulars in places like Gibraltar or Egypt to free up regulars for fighting in Europe. though as 1915 rolled on, they themselves were fielded in ever larger numbers on the Western Front. These men had volunteered to go to the front instead of serving at home, and did not have the training, the fitness, or the experience of the regulars. There were more of them, though, and soldiers also poured in from all corners of the British global empire. But the war that these men turned up for was rapidly changing as new weapons, subunit tactics, and leadership training developed. You had the widespread introduction of poison gas, aerial reconnaissance and combat, and platoon technologies like light machine guns, the Mills bomb, rifle grenades, and trench mortars. Grenades were great for clearing out trenches and dugouts without exposing yourself. They had begun use at the front as a locally made weapon, but the jam tin bombs were unpredictable and quite likely to kill the thrower instead of the enemy. The Mills bomb number 5 became the standard grenade in 1915, and the rifle grenade variant, the number 23, in 1917. The trench mortar, which the Germans brought to the war at its beginning, was another big innovation. Mortars themselves were old weapons, but their steep angle of fire was ideal for trench warfare, and the Stokes mortar was simple, lightweight, and portable, and was the infantry's artillery. With 1916 came Kitchener's army. These were the volunteers asked for by British Secretary of State for War Lord Herbert Kitchener in his iconic poster campaign. These men often served in platoons or companies with their friends from school or work. These PALS battalions were great for morale, sure, but an entire generation of men from a single town could be lost in one morning if that unit had a disaster in battle. And disasters to the new army certainly happened in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. Thing is, senior British leaders did not really trust the new army with having the initiative to move and fight in small units. So there was a kind of return to 1914 thinking. The plan at the Somme was to destroy the German defenses with artillery, walk across no man's land in battalion formation, and occupy the destroyed positions as the cavalry exploited the breakthrough. As we've seen in the regular episodes, this did not happen, but the march of progress continued. Tanks first saw battle in September 1916 as the British premiered them to the world. They were not very effective, but they did have enormous potential and showed that at least somebody was forward thinking.
That is actually something that's really interesting to me. And actually, believe it or not, World War I and roughly this time period in general is actually my personal favorite time and war frame to study. And I've always found it so interesting because you start out the war with traditional cavalry charges and you end the war with tanks and airplanes. And it's such a crucial transitioning time for warfare and I guess for humankind in general. And it's always so interesting to see the videos of the tanks that are rolling along, and you can also see the cavalrymen on their horses. It's very interesting, and I believe I've seen this one picture at one point of French soldiers even wearing the Napoleonic armor, which is pretty interesting. And I'm sure it was just for ceremony, but it's interesting, that connection from that time period, from the old world to the new world.
And from the battles of 1916 came the innovations of 1917. Specifically, the men were learning to coordinate arms, weapon systems, and branches of service to make a cohesive fighting force. But those men were no longer the old, the new, or the borrowed. Volunteers were drying up. So in 1916, Britain passed the Military Service Act, which introduced conscription. And by 1917, conscripts were being sent to the front with no experience and little training. Frontline training, though, had seriously improved. Brigades and divisions had organized training regiments, and soldiers spent a good part of their rest days training. The platoons were reorganized into a self-contained fighting unit with its own specialized troops, grenade throwers, machine gunners, snipers, and so forth. These would now all work together under a junior officer or sergeant on their own specific objectives. By the Battle of Cambrai in late 1917, infantry and tanks were even coordinated, with 3 tanks and a platoon working together, even as the infantry as a whole coordinated with the artillery. From then on, it was clear, especially in battles like Hamel and Amiens, that all of the branches of the army must work together with objectives designated all the way down to the smallest of units. So, the British soldier of 1918 was likely a conscript, but with a lot of experience. He worked in a small team that featured a variety of weapons specialists as opposed to just riflemen. He knew his unit's objectives, and he knew the ground he had to cover since vastly improved communications, improved reconnaissance, and intelligence analysis allowed for a detailed knowledge of the enemy positions. He knew what to expect from the artillery. He knew what the tanks were going to do and how to work with them. And initiative was expected and often encouraged at all levels, even down to the individual. You may wonder why this episode is just about the British. This is part of a series of specials about the tactics and development of the various nations' armies. If you know or would like to research something like that from a nation or a branch of service that we have not covered yet, please get in touch with Flo, our producer and social media guy. We would like to thank Mike Hayes.
Okay, awesome. I think this is the end of the video, so let's talk about this briefly. Yeah, so I really enjoyed that video. Like I said, the First World War and that time frame in general is just probably my favorite period to study, and I'm excited because I am going to be watching the several different videos that this channel has put out about the different armies involved and how they adapted over the course of the First World War. And I think the Endpoint did a really good job at emphasizing that soldiers, no matter where they're from or what time they're in, will always find ways to adapt and learn about the situation and environments that they're in, and that's just something that's universal with us and something that we just do. And it's nice to see that those that came before me found that as well. But if you guys enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton. Keep an eye out because the next couple of weeks I'm going to be putting out a lot of First World War videos. I hope you guys enjoy them, and I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about this this very influential and important war. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.